Chapter 5 of this training program will cover the board and personnel issues within the school district. The following positions, known as district officers, which include board members, are the only positions which report directly to the Board of Education. The Superintendent of Schools serves as a chief executive officer of the district. The Supervisor of Attendance or Attendance Officer, the District Clerk, otherwise known as the Board Clerk, the Treasurer, who is responsible for all accounting functions for the district, the Claims Auditor, who is authorized to audit and pay all bills and payrolls on behalf of the Board, the Internal Auditor, if the district has one, to conduct risk assessments and audit internal functions to identify areas of financial and operational improvement for the district, and the Tax Collector. With the exception of the superintendent, these positions are filled by board appointment annually at their reorganization meeting held in July of each school year. All other district employees have their appointment and termination actions approved by the board upon recommendation of the superintendent of schools. However, they are all under the supervisory jurisdiction of the superintendent, not the Board of Education. The superintendent and the board clerk will obviously meet with the board at board meetings. The board clerk's duties may appear to vary significantly from district to district, but this really depends upon duties that may be part of other positions to which that person is appointed, such as a superintendent's assistant. The internal auditor will meet with the audit committee established by the board, although it's possible that the board may request that the internal auditor also meet with the board itself periodically. As part of the external audit process, and at least once a year, the treasurer and the claims auditor should advise the board as to their experience with regard to business operations and accounting processes that they see internal to the district, as well as their experience with the external audit process.
Audit committees themselves do basically the same thing whether you're a large school or a small school. The distinction is if you're a large school with a large budget, you're going to have an internal auditor. And you do not necessarily have an internal auditor if you're a small school district. So what I'd like to do is to talk about what goes on in an audit committee in terms of what its functions really are. I think the first function that is really important is to deal with the issues of internal controls. And this really boils down to looking at separation of functions in its basic form, and it really has to do with separation of functions and making sure that in fact make sure that you don't have the same person doing a series of functions that could lead to the potential for some sort of fraud or theft. In other words, you don't have the same person processing claims, issuing checks, and making deposits. That leads to the potential that they could be, if they're doing all three of those things, they could actually be doing it in such a way that they're walking away with your money. So you want to make sure that those functions are carried out so that they're separately done by separate individuals. If that's not possible because you're short-staffed, there are other ways that you can accommodate that. Your business official know how to do that, and if in fact you're looking for help, you can go to organizations like your external auditor, and they'll give you advice on how you can handle the separation of functions in such a way that you protect yourself. But that's something that your audit committee can look at and help you out with, and that's a basic responsibility. Another thing that the audit committee should be looking at is the claims processing process, and this is where the claims auditor becomes an essential part of the work that you're looking at as an audit committee. The claims auditor is processing enough claims that they should be looking for repeated errors that are taking place. If the same kind of error is showing up over and over again, there's usually one of three things that's going on. Either there's a bad procedure, there's something wrong with the procedure that is resulting in the same error occurring over and over again. Example would be that there's missing signatures that are taking place on the claims forms. And that could be a procedural error that is occurring because of the way that the procedures are being written. There also could be an issue with regard to training, and that in the training process, a step is missing and it's being stepped over. In other words, the form is correct, but there's something wrong with the training, and that has to be fixed. It also could be a function of bad supervision, and that the supervisors are not paying attention to their role in either supervising the people who are filling out the claims form, or they're signing off on the claims form and not paying attention to the work. But in any case, those things should be looked at by the audit committee and made sure that they're corrected. So look for repeated errors in the claims processing area, and make sure that the procedures are correct. If not, look at training and look at supervision. Make sure those things get fixed. You don't want those dealt with in a problem. The other thing you do is you work with the external auditor. The process of rebidding for an external auditor is usually done by the audit committee in partnership with the business official. It's done at a minimum once every 5 years. You select that external auditor. That external auditor is going to come in and audit the books. There's a misunderstanding, by the way. A lot of people who come to the Board of Education are not familiar with the fact that the external auditor does not prepare the financial statements. Your business official prepares the financial statements. The external auditor comes in and they review the financial statements, and they audit the documentation that leads to that financial statement. They make sure that the documentation supports the financial statements, and they test to make sure that, in fact, that supporting documentation is valid and real, and therefore you can rely on the financial statements as a fair representation of the fiscal health of the district. Okay? If they find that there are errors in the documentation, they will note that stuff and make sure that you know about it, and let you know where the errors are and where they occurred, and provide assistance if necessary to support the correction of those kinds of errors. And they'll let you know right in the documents that they share with you. Normally, there's going to be there'll be a statement in their letter and a management response that comes from your management team as to how it is they're going to fix or have fixed the errors that have been found by the external auditor. It's very important that you listen carefully to what the external auditor is saying, and this is another function of the audit committee. And I would encourage you as a board, when the external auditor comes to report to the board, don't be afraid to ask the following question. Are you satisfied with the operation of our business office? Now, you may feel a little bit uncomfortable asking that question in the presence of the business official. Don't be, because that external auditor is actually reporting to you. And if there is a concern, they're going to tell you what they found. An example would be, we've had a situation where we had a new treasurer who came into the office. This person had very limited experience in accounting. This person was smart, and she was learning, but the reality is that she was learning and needed help. And one of the things that the external auditors were doing was providing her with, as they went through the audit process, providing her with guidance on how she could improve her work. And what they saw over the years, from year 1 to year 2 to year 3, was a significant amount of improvement in the way she was carrying out her work. So they recommended training that she could go to, and then they reported back to us every single year. So I was not embarrassed to ask the question, how is the business office running? And every year we got a report that demonstrated, and they were frank with us, she needs improvement in the following areas, and then they would report back the improvement is coming, and she has made significant progress, and the kinds of errors or needs that we saw in the beginning have been corrected. She is functioning very adequately at this stage of the game. You can feel comfortable that she knows what she's doing. So don't be afraid to ask those kinds of questions. Now, another thing you should know is that while they're auditing the books, they also can carry out very specific requests that you have. If there's an area of concern that you have and you want that area to be specifically looked at, you can ask them to do that as part of the audit function. Now, you may have to pay for that as an extra charge beyond what was the charge that was part of the bidding process. But if you're really concerned about a particular area, you can go and get that done. And so, again, this is one of those things that the audit committee can have a conversation with them on your behalf as a school board and charge them to get that work done. They'll negotiate at a price if it's necessary to do that, depending on the scope of the work involved. But you can actually have your external auditor get that out of the way. So those are the kinds of things that the audit committee could do. Now, if you have an internal auditor, there are some other things that are possible for you to look at. Basically, what most school districts do with the internal auditor is the first thing they look at is what I'm going to call low-hanging fruit. They're going to look at cleaning up or auditing internally those areas that are easily susceptible to potential for fraud. Extra classroom activity accounts, where cash is involved, but the management of cash is loose. Example would be students are collecting donations from car washes, and there's money coming in. It's placed into a box. Somebody's counting it, but it sits in the box in the teacher's office, and it sits there and for several days, and then eventually is given to the office, main office, and then finally sits after several days. It makes its way down to the main office, and then it's put into a safe, and then eventually gets counted again. But there's no record of what was in the original count, and it's never verified as it made its way from place to place. So there's really no record that shows that the money is the same as was originally collected, and there's no verification of who did the counts. So that's an area that needs to be straightened out. And that's where the internal auditor can do that kind of work to steadily track through and make sure, in fact, that there's an improvement in that, in that kind of work. And there are many areas like that. And by the way, this is the kind of thing when the state controller's office comes in to audit the books, this is the kind of stuff they go after. They can make political hay out of that kind of inconsistencies or errors in practice, and point them out, and it looks like there's the potential for all kinds of fraud and whatever, and it's really creates a lot of aggravation for the school district, and it's really unnecessary. So the internal auditor usually goes after those things and cleans them up pretty quick, and that's typical of what goes on. But there are other areas that you can begin to start to use that internal auditor for. The internal auditor is part of the management team in the sense of you can use that as a management tool. Your superintendent may have areas of concern that are much larger and really need to be looked at. Example would be, how are you doing with regard to documentation associated with Medicaid billing? Are you keeping good track of the numbers of hours of PT and OT time that are being provided to Medicaid eligible students who are receiving services, and is that properly recorded so that in fact it can be tracked for the purposes of Medicaid billing? If that's not being done, those bills could be audited by the Medicaid auditors and disallowed. That's a vulnerability. That's a big potential ticket item that you may want to have, that may want the internal auditor to look at. There are other examples of major issues that the internal auditor can look at after the low-hanging fruit has been remediated. So, but these kinds of discussions should be had by the superintendent with the members of the audit committee to identify larger managerial concerns that the superintendent has that can be explored by the internal auditor. It really doesn't have to be the kinds of things that I described first as what they call the low-hanging fruit. There could be larger concerns of management issues that can be taken on by the internal auditor. And it does not have to be a financial issue. It could also be a programmatic issue. And there are things that they can look at that are program-driven, that are of significant concern. An example would be the Medicaid audit stuff. The documentation on the services has a financial impact, but it's really about the management of the service delivery system and the documentation of the service delivery. And that's a program issue at first, but ultimately results in a financial vulnerability. So there may be others of that nature that the superintendent will identify, and concerns that he has that, or he or she has, that need to be addressed. So the audit committee, basic functions, I laid them out, and the use of the internal auditor can be as simple and basic as those issues that I first identified, and could be much larger based upon the management needs that are identified by the superintendent.
Staff appointments usually cover positions such as custodians, bus drivers, food service workers, monitors, aides, clerks, secretaries, etc. These are covered under civil service law and are subject to determination by a county civil service commission or by a local city commission regarding the correct title and classification as either exempt, highly confidential, labor, unskilled, non-competitive, an examination is not practical, or competitive. The job requirements can be tested and scores ranked. Learn the process for recruiting and appointing these positions from your superintendent and administrators. However, the following is general information which probably covers normal processes. For these positions, it is normal that there will be a posting for filing these positions from within the district before any effort to recruit from outside the district. This is normally a function of a collective bargaining agreement and is driven by a concern for promotions as well as transfers of employees from other titles. Recruiting from outside the district will normally involve publishing the availability of these positions in local newspapers or other recruiting vehicles such as websites. An application will normally be completed by a candidate. This may be supplemented by the inclusion of a resume. An application review will take place, and initial interviews will be conducted by the supervisor, and candidates will be referred on for a second interview by the department head. It is not likely that non-supervisory positions will be subject to further review or interviews at higher levels. However, supervisory positions may be reviewed by a committee of administrators or individual members of the administrative team. Final appointments will be made upon recommendation of the superintendent by the Board of Education. Appointment to these positions may become very important to individual members of the board because candidates are likely to come from the community and may be known by the board members. Consequently, it may be that board members will be spoken to by community members on behalf of candidates. It is appropriate to acknowledge the availability of the position, but it is essential not to put yourself in a position of offering to lobby or push for the appointment. Since you are not part of the overall process, except at the very end, there is very little opportunity for a board member to influence the outcome of the process. And while you may know the individual on a personal basis, you may not be in a position to evaluate them against the requirements for the job being filled. If you are approached this way, it is important that you let the superintendent know about the situation and advise him or her of the nature of the conversation that took place. You may seek advice on how to respond to any other further conversation that arises about this particular applicant. Certified appointments include teachers, teacher assistants, and principals. Special note: while teacher assistants are certified positions, they may not be in the same bargaining unit with teachers. They might be in their own unit or in the unit with their non-instructional staff. Most teacher assistants were originally teacher aides and became retitled and certified as teacher assistants by regulations through a grandfathering process or additional education. Hence, as a group, might have changed bargaining unit at the time of the title change. Learn the process for recruiting and appointing these positions from your superintendent and administrators. However, the following is general information which probably covers normal processes. For these positions, it is normal that there will be a posting for filling these positions from within the district before an effort to recruit from outside the district. This is normally a function of collective bargaining agreement requirements and is driven by a concern for teachers seeking changes in certification areas. For example, from special education to elementary education, or to transfer to another school building. Sometimes past practice dictates that teachers are assigned to grades or buildings and cannot be moved between grades or buildings without going through a posting or bidding process. This may or may not affect appointment status, and this may not be relevant in all districts. Principals might have some constraints on transfer among buildings and among elementary, middle, and high schools. Again, this will be the subject of local circumstances. Otherwise, basic recruitment process will be similar to those for teachers. It is also not uncommon that superintendents may use their own network of other superintendents or principals to identify potential candidates. There may also be candidates from within the ranks of teachers who have completed administrative certifications and principals in other school districts who would be good candidates. For external recruiting, the most prevalent source of advertising is the Online Application System for Educators, OLAS. The system is used by most colleges and university graduates, as well as teachers and administrators and other professionals. It is used for both searching for job opportunities throughout the educational community and sending applications to specific openings. Of course, local newspapers and other publications are also used to recruit job applicants for open positions. The selection process for teachers has become both more complex and more rigorous. There is, of course, the traditional review of resumes. This provides the first cut at candidate pool. It is quite common that an interview team will be convened made up of teachers and administrators to view resumes from within the applicant pool. They will then select applicants for interviews. The interviews will normally include both a face-to-face interview and perhaps an observation of the applicant, usually teaching in a classroom setting. Depending on the results of the interview and the teacher's performance, the pool will be reduced further and references will be checked. Recommendations will then be made to the principal, who will interview candidates and refer the finalists to the superintendent. In very large districts with many school buildings, the principal's recommendation may be final, but in smaller districts, the superintendent may actually conduct his or her own interview before recommending appointments to the board. With respect to teacher appointments, it is highly likely that as a school board member, you will get questions and inquiries from friends, parents, and relatives of applicants asking for assistance in the recruitment and appointment process. It is important that you advise the superintendent of the interest of people that has been expressed to you. It is also essential that you remember that the recruitment and selection process is very complex, involves a great many steps, and has many parties involved in it, and virtually has no role for you as a board member. As a consequence, letting the individual know that you will share their interest in this matter directly with the superintendent is a satisfactory response. Going any further may only create expectations that cannot be met and may just result in hard feelings. Selection process for principals is equally rigorous. Again, either a committee or the superintendent will review resumes to reduce the candidate field to a more reasonable number of candidates for further review. Usually, the interview team will include other administrators, parents, teachers, and sometimes students. The pool will again be reduced to a more manageable number. The finalists will begin with the opportunity to tour the building and meet holders and spend time in the building and in the community. There will also be ample opportunity for the candidates to meet with the superintendent. Finally, interviews will take place for the top few finalists with either a committee of the board or the full Board of Education. Depending upon the process that is used by the board and the superintendent, a discussion will ensue regarding the consensus between the board and the superintendent on the selection of the appropriate candidate for that principal position. While this selection process seems to be rather long and elaborate, board members must understand that principals are the front line of leadership in the educational environment. As such, they are extremely important in the whole area of advancing educational achievement in our school systems. They are primarily of importance in communicating effectively with stakeholders and especially parents. They are also a major source of faculty leadership and collaboration in each of our school buildings. They are very important positions and must be filled carefully. Many licensed professionals, such as psychologists, physical therapists, occupational therapists, are also hired by school districts. Some licensed professionals, such as social workers, school psychologists, speech pathologists, are appointed as certified employees, while other licensed professionals, such as nurses and occupational or physical therapists, are appointed under civil service law. For further information about these distinctions, consult your business official or superintendent. Most licensed professionals and paraprofessionals are employed as part of the special education programs of districts. Recruitment can use OLAS, professional journals, or other publications. Smaller districts may take advantage of shared arrangements by using staff that are made available through the local BOCES. While the BOCES will recruit and hire such staff or have such staff already employed, a district may want to have a say in the assignment of shared staff to it. But it is highly likely that some of these professionals will be employees of the district, for example, licensed social workers. Licenses are granted by the State Education Department. Checking if licenses are in good standing is good practice. There is also specific requirements for licensing that must take into consideration when hiring if your district is billing for Medicaid reimbursement for eligible student services. Questions in this area should be directed to your superintendent or director of pupil personnel services. Licensed professionals operate as members of a team in concert with other professionals and with special education teachers and regular education teachers. Consequently, the recruitment and selection process should not only reflect a concern for the specific discipline competencies, but also a good fit for the team work required within the building and the district. Once again, it is important to ask about the process used in your district for assessing these attributes and for how the recommendation ultimately is made to the board.
You've heard a lot about the process or the appointment and selection of various types of employees that work for the district. Those that are certified, those that are licensed, those that are in the unclassified positions. I want to talk to you a little bit about the overall process of the appointment and selection process and give you some other advice given your role as a school board member. First thing I want to stress is that you need to get to know the appointment process itself. And in this regard, I think it's very important that you understand the process that is used for the selection and appointment of each type of employee that takes place. I'll give you an example. In Scotic Central School District, we use a very special process for the selection of teachers. We use the regular recruitment tools that are out there for having people apply for positions. But when they come into the district, we narrow down the search based upon the resumes, and then we use a very special process for actually interviewing them and then screening them as we narrow down to the point of making a choice. We use our own faculty members to actually interview the candidates. And this is done for a couple of reasons. One of which is that we want to make sure that the teachers demonstrate a certain level of competency, and we want to make sure that our faculty members feel very comfortable that those people have a certain measure of competency. And we feel very comfortable that our teachers are very capable of being able to measure that skill set that the candidates present. The other part of this is that we have a very strong cultural tradition in Schodack, and our teachers are well grounded in that culture. And that culture is not only just about themselves, but about their feelings for children and their feelings for the community. It is a culture that is very well articulated by the teachers that combines their relationships amongst themselves, their relationships to the students, and their relationships to the community. And they want to make sure that anybody that comes in is going to fit into that cultural environment and is going to be consistently, can be molded, I guess is the best way to say it, can fit into the mold that is reflective of that culture. And so they're going to look for someone that is going to be a good fit. The second thing we do is that we actually put them into a classroom environment and we let them teach. And we want to see if they can demonstrate the skill set that we saw when we went through the interview process. And that's a very important part of the process for us. So the teachers play a very significant role in the evaluation of candidates. And of course, we then go through the regular process of an interview with the principals, and then we move on to an interview with the superintendent. Now we're lucky, we're small. I mean, most large districts, the interview process probably stops with the principal, building principal. And then, in our case, we're small, so that we can have the superintendent actually involved in the interview process with a candidate. But the key is to understand that there is this vetting process that takes place with the teachers, and it's really about making sure that they mesh well both at the skill set level and at the cultural level. And we understand that as board members. We understand the process. There's a similar kind of process that takes place with school bus drivers. And that may sound strange, but there is also a culture that's associated with the drivers that we have. The drivers understand that they are responsible for our kids from the time the front door opens and they step out of the house to the time that they walk back into the house at the end of the day. And that's the kind of thing that they get it. And so that when they're hired, they need to understand that right up front. And I see it. I mean, I had a conversation with one of our school bus drivers, and I was just amazed. He said to me, he says, and he articulated this. I have a very tough run. I have probably the most difficult kids on my run. But you know what? Those kids need me. I make a difference in their lives. And I understood that he came from another district where he was a bus driver in that district, and he came to Skodak, and within 1 year, he reflected the culture of our community. So I understand the process, and I understand the culture, and I know that when we hire people, that process and that culture is reflected in the way we go about our hiring process. And I would encourage you, get to understand the process that takes place in your district. Because once you understand that process, you build trust in the process. And so it really doesn't make any difference what the details are of the selection, the recruitment process and the selection process. If you're comfortable with the process and you have trust in it, then in fact you will be okay. And you'll know that the people that are being hired are the right ones. That their attributes, their skills, and their fit into the district are matching up with what the expectations are, and they will be successful. That's the thing that really counts. You want them to be successful, no matter whether they're a custodian or they are a teacher or they're a principal or whoever. It's about making them successful, because ultimately their success results in the success for your children. And that's the thing that you want to understand. Now, let's talk a little bit about what you do when you're approached by people from the community who are interested in supporting a job for their son, their daughter, their wife, whomever. I think there are a couple rules here, one of which is that I think you got to be responsive. If they want your help, you need to say to them, I will share your interest with the superintendent of schools. I know that you want to encourage this person for the job. I know that I would suggest that you follow the following process. Make sure they get their application in. Here's how you would go about doing that, so that you know that they are letting the proper channels know that they're interested in the position, that they filed the right application, they've gone through the right process. I will share your interest with the superintendent of schools. Once you've done that, you need to then get back to that person and let them know that you did it. Close the loop. The thing you need to do is make sure you stay out of the process. You cannot influence it. And I think that's the second part of this thing, is that you got to be honest. Don't let on that you can influence the process. Don't make it appear that you have the ability to make a difference in the hiring. You got to remember something. All the people who work in the district, with just a few exceptions, are employees who are under the authority of the superintendent of schools. they don't work for you. They work for the superintendent. Yes, you go through a process of appointing them at the school board meetings, but the reality is that they are under the supervision of the superintendent of schools. And your role in the selection process and in the appointment process of those individuals is minimal at best. And so ultimately, you have no real authority. So if you imply that you have a role in the selection of that individual, you're really not being honest with the person that is coming to you and asking for a favor. So don't make an assertion that you can influence this whole thing. You say to them, I will make your interest known. I have made your interest known. If there's any further information you want me to share with the superintendent, I will do that. If that's all you need to do. And because you're sharing the information that you can, don't imply anything further than that. There's another aspect of this, and that is that, and I think we've covered it before, that there's always this concern about conflict of interest when a relative of yours is an employee of the district. And I'm going to share something very personal. My wife was a school teacher in Scotic Central School District. She had been hired by another school district as a school nurse teacher. She went through a time when they abolished all of the school nurse teachers in that district and hired them back as school nurses. She took a fairly substantial cut in pay, and but she still retained some responsibility for supervising the health offices in some of the schools, and she supervised the health office assistants who worked in those schools. So she had some degree of supervisory experience, and she had had experience being a school nurse teacher in those districts. There came a time when there was a retirement in Schodack and of a school nurse teacher who also provided supervisory experience across the 3 buildings that we had for the school health offices. She applied and was accepted as the school nurse teacher in our middle school, and had responsibilities for not just running the nurse's office in that school, but also for teaching health in that middle school, and nominally was to supervise the 2 nurses that ran the health offices in the other 2 schools. The issue that I want to talk to you about was the whole tenure appointment process. I made a decision that I would stay out of the whole set of tenure discussions. It turned out that this was a good thing for me to do. And the reason for that is that tenure discussions get down to looking at things like personality, competencies, technical things that couldn't have been uncomfortable for me. And I really did not want to have that occur. It also turns out that the principal who was making the tenure recommendations to the superintendent had some issues with me that I did not realize. And it surfaced in the discussions around my wife. It may have been a little bit unfair, but the reality was that it got to be a little bit testy. And there were a series of discussions that took place. And by the way, I don't know what they were. Nobody ever shared anything with me. So confidentiality that took place in executive session regarding the tenure discussions was never broken. So I never knew. All I had was a sense of the difficulty that was taking place in the tenure discussions that were associated with my wife. I'm very glad that I stayed out of those discussions, not only because it would have been uncomfortable for me, but I also think that it would have been difficult for me with regard to dealing with my wife. I had a sense that she had difficulties dealing with the principal around this set of issues. I know she went from being an elementary school nurse teacher and nurse to a middle school, and that transition was a little bit rocky at first, and that's not uncommon. So I imagine that it was something to do with that. But the bottom line here is that that's what I'm saying to you is that in all of these things that have to do with personnel, you have to recognize that there are personality issues associated with any hiring and any probationary circumstance, and any issue that has to do with the relationship between an individual and a supervisor. You live in that community, and you're going to hear stuff. You're going to hear complaints, you're going to hear problems, you're going to hear concerns, and people are going to come to you. And when they do that, it's going to create a difficulty for you. And so, in all those circumstances, the thing you need to do is to listen and say, look, I hear you. I will share your concern, but don't get involved. Don't pretend. Be honest about the issue. I will share your concern. Go ahead and share it. Get back to them. I did share the issue, the concern, and I know that it's being looked into, and that's it. Because if you get involved, first of all, you're not there. You don't know what was said. You don't know the circumstances. You don't want to get involved in that. And I'm just telling you, don't be very, very circumspect and very, very careful with all of this. You don't have the authority to be able to deal with any of this. And if you start to get embroiled in it, you're going to end up in a very, very difficult position. It gets too personal, and it's very, very difficult. So I guess what I'm saying to you, all the way down through all of these things that involve personnel, is that understand what the process is. Get to the point where you feel comfortable with the process, trust the process, trust the people that are involved in the process, and respect the fact that you really have no authority with regard to this, and then be a good messenger and make sure you close the loop with the people that have come to you with concerns, issues, or requests. That's the best you can do.
A bargaining unit is a group of employees with a clear and identifiable community of interest who are, under U.S. law, represented by a labor union in collective bargaining and other dealings with management. It is possible that one union could represent more than one bargaining unit. What is the board's role? There is no single way the negotiations process is carried out in school districts, and therefore no single way boards are involved. There are several considerations in the bargaining process. The size of the district can make a difference. This may affect the number of bargaining units and the number of management confidential employees that can help in the negotiations process. Large districts may have personnel departments with staff that can help in data collection and sometimes in active representation of management at the bargaining table. Sometimes a business official or business manager will negotiate contracts for certain bargaining units, essentially support service units covering functions such as maintenance, transportation, or custodial work. It's likely that a superintendent will be involved in negotiations in especially small districts, but not necessarily is the chief negotiator. The superintendent becomes a valuable resource in the planning and caucusing process for the board and/or management team. It's generally not recommended that a board member serve as the chief negotiator. If this is done, it is highly unusual, because negotiations that take place within the structure of New York State Taylor law, it is essential that care be given to the rules of the game, and it may be that a board member might not be aware of these and therefore might make mistakes. This can be especially the case if the bargaining units are represented by professional negotiators from the parent union organizations, for example, New York State United Teachers or CSEA. Boards can hire professional negotiators to represent the district. There are usually 3 sources of these professionals. Law firms offer these services. Some independent or partnerships of professional labor relations specialists also provide these services, and some BOCES also provide this service, and if provided by a BOCES, this service is available with BOCES state aid. A committee of the board will often be appointed to be involved in negotiations. This committee will stay on top of issues as they evolve in the bargaining process. The committee will also keep the board apprised of progress and bring important issues to the board. sometimes committees will attend negotiation sessions to witness the process firsthand. They may also participate if the ground rules which were established by the parties at the beginning of the process negotiations agree to permit this to occur. This level of participation may occur if the union team of employee representatives also wishes to participate in the bargaining process. It is important to note that if board members are officially part of the negotiating team and they are party to signing off on tentative agreement to the contract settlement, when the contract settlement is brought to the Board of Education for approval, those board members who were part of the negotiation team are obligated to vote in favor of the contract. They approve the tentative agreement and therefore they must support it and they must vote in favor of it. To do otherwise would be evidence of the board's negotiating in bad faith. The district's administrative team is very valuable in the negotiating process. Building principals and other supervisors are responsible for day-to-day administration of the collective bargaining agreements. As such, they understand both the big and small problems encountered in contract administration. They also understand the nuances of the contract on day-to-day employee relations and can anticipate when problems are likely to occur. They also anticipate problems that may arise out of contract proposals that are suggested by others who may not be familiar with day-to-day operations and experiences. Finally, they can analyze ideas or proposals put forward by the unions that may have administrative impacts that might otherwise be missed. The bottom line is use your administrators wisely in the negotiation process. Even if they are not represented in planning meetings or meetings to discuss rebuttals to union proposals, it is important that those administrators and the superintendent be given time to the impacts on the day-to-day and long-term operations.
I don't want to talk to you about the different approaches to collective bargaining. There are just too many, they're too varied. They depend too much on tradition and culture and from district to district, and they also depend a great deal on the competency of the various people that are going to carry out collective bargaining. And so what I'd rather do is talk to you about what you should be doing as a Board of Education. So let me sort of lay out some ground rules that you can follow. The first thing, I think, is you need to be very clear about the message you're sending to whoever is going to actually carry out the collective bargaining process. And the message has to be a single message from you as a group. It is a collective message from the board, and it has to be very, very clear. If you're divided or you're confused or you don't know what it is that you want to be done, then you're not telling that person what it is that you want them to accomplish. Example would be, I want the salary increase to be no more than 2%. You're telling them very clear. Now, if you don't know what that salary increase should be in terms of its limits, you can say to them, I want the salary increase to be in the range of 1 to 3%. But you got to give them some clear parameters on what it is that you want them to achieve. So, and it has to be an agreed upon parameter or agreed upon objective by the whole board. If you're divided or you're confused or you can't give a collective position, then in essence what you're doing is you're setting them up for a very difficult time, because if they come back with a position and you're not on the same page as a school board, you're gonna get them all. You're making it impossible for them to do what they have to do. And that leads me to the second rule, is that you have to be consistent. And this becomes very important. Is the fundamental principle in collective bargaining is that you have to be bargaining in good faith. And what that means is that if you put out a position, you can't backtrack on it. So if you offer the teachers union a 2% raise, and then later on decide that that's too much and you want to take it back and you want to offer them a 1% raise, that's bargaining in bad faith. So you can't be inconsistent in what you're doing. So it's very important that, as I said in the first rule, is you got to have a very clear message, and it has to be a collective message. So and that means it's got to be consistent. So if you're not on the same page with everybody else on the board, and you're not consistent, you set up the possibility of the bargainer finding themselves in a situation where they're bargaining in bad faith, and they're not going to do it and they'll tell you they can't do it because under law it's impossible for them to do it, and they'll be slapped with an improper practice under the Taylor law. So they're not going to do that kind of thing. Finally, you got to remember that in the end, under the collective bargaining process, a good bargain is one where nobody's happy. That means the Board of Education and the union are not happy. Nobody gets everything they want. If one party gets everything they want, the other one is really going to be miserable. And so what ends up happening is there's a compromise. And that means that I didn't get everything I wanted, and you didn't get everything you wanted. We went as far as we could, and we ended up in a position where it's the best that we could do. This is the best that I could do. This is the best that you could do. And neither one of us is completely satisfied, but we're walking away from the table saying this is the best that we could do. Now, this is one of those things that there have to be, you got to get to the point where there's no regrets. You know, you can say to yourself, well, I really wanted a lot more give on health insurance, but I didn't get it, and I'm really unhappy. Well, yeah, you're unhappy, but the reality was you weren't going to get it, and it's the best that you could do. Did you get something? Maybe, maybe not, but it's the best that you could do under the circumstances, and you ended up getting a contract, and that's what you wanted. They probably didn't get what they wanted. They didn't get the salary adjustment that they wanted, but the bottom line is that you ended up reaching an agreement, and it's the best that you could do. You got to be satisfied with that. So there's three basic things that you got to understand. Okay? Now, let me just tell you that I think in these times, the biggest problem that we have in collective bargaining is the tax cap. It has really changed everything. In the old days, before the tax cap, we could reach a settlement, and we could then raise taxes in order to fund that settlement. Right now, we have a problem in that there are aspects to a settlement that are limited by the amount of funds that we can raise. Our state aid is a function of whatever they're going to give us, and the tax cap basically limits how much tax levy we can raise. We get to the point where we know what our fixed costs are, we know what our increments are, and we know what we can afford in terms of how much money we can raise by the limits of the tax levy based upon the tax cap. So the reality is that we can tell them exactly where we're at. And if they wanted to, they can actually calculate the tax cap as well as us. So the bottom line is there's no room for anybody to go. And if health insurance is rising at a particular level, and if the pension costs are rising at a particular level, and increments are rising at a particular level, what's left for salary adjustment? And we have, this may sound strange to you, but the teachers are telling us, you don't appreciate us anymore. In the past, you appreciated us and you showed us you appreciated us because you would give us salary increases. Now you're telling us that you appreciate us, but you can't give us a salary increase. And we look at them and we say, but we don't have any money to give you. And they say, but you always took care of us in the past. And you say, but the past is gone. There's a new world. And it's very difficult for everybody to come to grips with that. Now, I think everybody is beginning to accept that there is a new world. But I think it's posed a real change in the collective bargaining environment. And if you look at the changes that are taking place in your personnel cost structure, what you're going to find is that the largest single component of your personnel cost is health insurance. I'm sorry, I said that wrong. The largest rising component or increasing component of your personnel costs is health insurance. And it's being driven not just by your actives, but also by your retirees. So if you were to take and draw a bar graph and take each of the component parts of your budget, of your personnel costs, you'll see that the pension costs are relatively, it's modest increases because there are some controls that are being put in place, and the economy has been taking pretty much control of affecting that at a much more modest rate. Your increments rise at a fairly predictable level, and if you look at we've leveled off with regard to the percentage increases in salaries. But when you look at the health insurance piece and you look at the number of people that are passing into retirement and the fact that as they pass into retirement, most of their health insurance benefits are guaranteed at the time that they retire, you end up seeing that particular rise is the biggest rising or the largest rising component part of your salaries, and there's nothing you can do to control it. And that's the one area that the unions are fighting hardest to maintain the benefit levels in. So we're in an environment where we're stuck, and getting givebacks in health insurance is extremely difficult because there's no trade-offs, and the only trade-off you're faced with is layoffs, or reductions in program, which translates to layoffs. And the bottom line here is who gets hurt in all of this? Well, unfortunately, it's your students. So this is a terrible conundrum. And a terrible situation for school board members, because what you're doing is you're pitting programmatic impacts on students against the wishes and desires of the unions, and that's a terrible situation. And getting that across to someone that is looking for a salary increase, driven potentially by the need for funding college tuition for their own children, very, very difficult thing, and I don't know where we go with this thing, and as I've said in the past on some of the other elements of this discussion with you, a lot of this is driven by politics, and we'll have to see how this takes care of itself, because the real ultimate controlling factor in all of this is how the state legislature and the governor are going to deal with the pressures that are arising out of the union movement in general, because this tax cap affects us as school board members, but it also is now going to be affecting the unions on a statewide basis as well. So we'll have to wait and see where this is going, but the impact of the tax cap on collective bargaining is really very, very significant.
When both parties believe they can go no further in the negotiations process, they decide they are at an impasse. The first step beyond impasse is mediation. The parties will notify the Public Employees Relation Board, which will assign a mediator to work with both the district and the bargaining unit. The mediator's role is to attempt to find points of agreement or compromise that will help the parties move towards a contract settlement. The mediator will identify strong and weak points in the arguments of each party and seek, in private discussions with each party, to see where compromise can be reached. Periodically, the mediator may bring the parties together, but for the most part, the mediator moves back and forth between the parties, carrying messages and proposal to each party, seeking to achieve movement towards compromise. The mediator has no authority to force a settlement, and if the parties decide that they cannot reach an agreement, the process will come to an end and impasse proceeds without further mediation. There is no arbitration process under the Taylor Law for school district negotiations. Arbitration is where a third party sits in judgment and renders an independent and binding decision and outcome to the negotiations. Therefore, the parties can remain at impasse for as long as they wish. Usually, at some point, one of the parties will reach out to the other and suggest that they return to the bargaining table and try again to reach a settlement. Impasse can last a few months or could go on for years. Under the Triborough Amendment to the Taylor Law, the negotiating unit employees are entitled to receive all of the benefits and all of the terms and conditions which were in existence under the expired contract. They also receive any step salary increases that were part of that contract. Any other changes that would otherwise be negotiated under the new contract, which might have been settled, are not in effect and therefore have no impact on the old contract. In essence, the old contract's provision for percentage sharing of health insurance or other benefit costs remain the same. Most boards believe that the provisions of this amendment work in favor of the unions during the period of time after a contract has expired and until a new contract is settled. Union employees are guaranteed to receive all of the benefits under the old contract plus any step increases, and all of the old provisions that affect terms and conditions of employment also stay in effect. Management's interest in reducing benefit costs, improving management prerogatives in the administration of the contract, or in minimizing future costs through changes in the structure of salary or benefits are not possible during this period of time. It is highly unlikely that changes to current law will take place.
One of the other consequences of the difficulties that are imposed on the collective bargaining process as a result of the tax cap is the difficulties in reaching an agreement. And I think you understand, given what I've just said, about why that is so difficult. This will probably force more and more of the bargaining processes into impasse. And what that means is that you can't reach agreement. And at that point, either you or the unions decide that you cannot reach an agreement, and you decide that you're going to go into an impasse. And you declare impasse, and at that point in time, you search out a mediator. And seeking out a mediator means that you go to PERB, and there are a list of mediators, and you get some sort of agreement on who the mediator is going to be, and if you're lucky, you get a good one. But mediation doesn't mean that you're necessarily going to reach any sort of agreement. It's not like binding arbitration, where in fact a decision is reached by the arbitrator. In the case of mediation, it's nothing more than having someone go back and forth between the parties and try to encourage some degree of compromise and movement between the individuals. So the mediator literally goes back and forth between the two negotiating parties and tries to identify areas of compromise and seek to get the parties to begin to start to move towards some degree of agreement and compromise. The problem with that is that it has no, it can't force anything to happen. And if the parties are really far apart and they're really very firm in their position, then mediation can just go on and on until both parties or one of the parties says, "That's it, I've had enough of this, and we're going to stop this." And it has been the case that, we went for, I think it was 2 years without a contract. And we tried mediation, and it got frustrating for the mediator and frustrating for both parties, and then we stopped it. And we just decided that both parties could live without a contract. Things went along okay, because we both knew that there was nothing that could be done at that stage of the game. There was enough cultural glue to hang the parties together so that we got along okay. There was no adverse reaction on the part of the faculty to our students or to the administration, and basically school maintained school. Kids got educated. Things went along. Our basic regular extracurricular activities took place. Parents didn't notice any difference, and things just sort of moved along. In part, this has to do with the fact that when you get into a situation like this, under the Triborough Agreement, all of the benefits and all the provisions of the prior contract stay in place. There is no cost of living adjustment, but the increments move forward. So teachers were getting salary increases based upon the increments, and as far as those increments were basically higher than the cost of living, so that they were okay at that stage of the game. They were getting something, and life moved on. And mediation didn't work, so that was the end of it. We just went a couple years without a contract. So it's one of those things that, in the current environment, I think you're going to see potentially more impasses. On the other hand, we're hearing that many contracts are being settled where the cost of living component of the contract is very small. We're also seeing some changes in the types of contracts that are being developed, where there's diminishment in the numbers of steps in the contract. There's also been some movement on health insurance But the bottom line is that while you hear some of these things, I don't think there's a widespread movement towards rapid change in the structure of salaries and benefits across the board as a result of the need for some degree of change. I think everybody's kind of walking on eggshells at this stage of the game. But just to let you know, impasse, mediation, they don't necessarily result in any rapid movement. It usually is one of those things where it gets to the point where people just say, okay, fine, we're going to fix this on our own. We'll figure out what we need to do, and then the parties will get back together when they feel that they've had enough and they're willing to make the compromises necessary to move forward. But it's not that impasse and mediation actually has a big benefit, unless there's some real skill on the part of the mediator and some willingness to actually really move. It's also possible that there was out of the collective bargaining process, there was a misunderstanding, and maybe the mediator picks up on that and can fix it. But usually it's some deep-seated disagreement, or position that is held by either one of the two parties that is so firmly cemented in place that they're just not going to budge. And if that's the case, the impasse will just last until the parties decide that they're finally going to reach agreement. So in any event, I think you're going to see more impasses, and I don't know that mediation is going to solve the problem. I think that the conundrum that we face is much bigger, and ultimately is going to require some sort of political decision, and it'll rise out of Albany.
Contract administration is generally the responsibility of supervisors. The hierarchy of the supervisory structure usually defines the process an employee will follow to try to resolve a dispute. If a dispute is grounded in the contract and cannot be resolved through the supervisory structure, the employee will consult with the union to determine if the matter merits using the grievance process, which is set forth in the union's contract as a way to resolve the issue. If a grievance is started, the steps followed are clearly delineated in the contract. After a decision by the superintendent, the matter can be sent to the board for review in executive session. Again, the process is defined in the contract. Depending on the outcome of the board decision, the matter may go to an outside arbitrator. As a board, you will be advised by your superintendent and school attorney as to the process to be followed to handle grievances that come before the board. Those which go beyond the board to arbitration will require additional cost to be borne by the district. However, it is usually the case that grievances that reach this level have significant impact on current or future operations and usually significant financial implications. Therefore, the board should very carefully consider its role in these grievances. During the time between the contract negotiations, there may arise issues that need to be resolved between the district and the union. In many cases, these are issues that make sense to be settled because they are in the interest of both parties. In these cases, the superintendent and union will structure a memorandum of understanding or an agreement between the bargaining unit and the district that reflects the agreement. He or she will then bring it to the board in executive session for review and discussion. If the board is in agreement, it will approve this memorandum in open session. Usually, the MOUs are then incorporated into the collective bargaining agreement developed at the next bargaining session.
As a board member, you're going to find out about grievances after the problem has actually erupted. It's not usually the case that you're going to find out that a grievance is coming until it's actually been filed. And this is most likely due to the fact that these type of things bubble along until there's an eruption, and then once it's erupted, it's usually a decision made on the part of the union that they want to take it to a higher level, and they want to, quite frankly, push this thing into the grievance process itself. In some schools, they are much more amenable, I guess the best way to put it, towards using the grievance process to solve things. In other school districts, they'd rather work things out and avoid using the grievance process. What tends to happen is that the grievance process involves getting higher levels of the union involved. It takes it away from the actual local people. In the case of my experience with us in Skodak is that if you go beyond the first step, usually NICET gets involved and they bring in guns from the local NICET reps, and then all of a sudden it takes on a very different thing. What you end up finding is sometimes it's a very local issue, and then NICET is providing guidance to how to resolve that. And sometimes it's very interesting that the local issue actually has more significance than is realized by the local people, and then it takes on a very, very different thing. It takes on a policy issue framework for NICET in general. And at that point in time, it's a real problem for a local school district. And you may not recognize it when you first get involved in it. We had one of these recently that we were advised by our attorney that this was the issue. And I don't want to go into the nature of the issue, but the issue represented a significant policy concern for NICET that if we won, it would have set a precedent for NICET that it did not want to see occur. And as a consequence, they were going to take this as far as they possibly could in the courts. It was that important to them. Now, they have attorneys on staff that are paid for out of the union's funds. Unlike us, as we were to step through the courts, we would be paying more and more legal fees out of our budget. And so, the choice for us was to either reach a settlement and keep it out of the courts, or spend potentially as much as $100,000 to litigate this particular issue in the courts. And at that point, we had to make a very significant decision. Was this grievance, this issue, worth spending a lot of money? Quite frankly, NICET had a bottomless pit. They had a lot of money, and for them, if they wanted to take this thing through the courts, they could keep appealing this thing up the chain until they literally bankrupted us. And so we had to make a decision, and eventually we came to the conclusion that it really wasn't worth it, and that if we had to, we would compromise and basically settle out the grievance in order to avoid the high level of cost. It just was not worth it to us. And so that actually resolved itself in that manner. We found a way to change some language in the contract in order to be able to accommodate their interest, and it was a compromise. We didn't give them everything they wanted, but at the same point in time, we recognized that it really wasn't worth going all the way through the courts in order to resolve this thing. We thought we had a legitimate case. On the other hand, we had to make some arrangement to compromise with them, and I think that's the kind of thing you run into sometimes, is that they have a perspective and you got to deal with it. Sometimes you fight it because you think you can win and you think it's worth it for you locally to take them on in that case, and I think you're making a judgment call. As you go through the step process, you're going to find that your role gets more and more involved as a school board in terms of dealing with it. You're going to be advised all the way through by your attorneys, and it costs you money. But the bottom line is you don't want to make a mistake as you go through the grievance process, because ultimately it could cost you both in terms of administrative time, administrative procedures, loss of control. It could cost you money. So the grievance process is kind of tricky, and it's important that it be managed properly. And I think that's the most important part of this thing. You listen carefully to what the superintendent, administrators, and your attorneys have to say. Your role is to exercise some judgment in this, but ultimately, you're not responsible for administration of the contract. You're responsible for signing off on the contract, but the administration of the contract is really what is being done by the principals and the superintendent. And the grievances arising out of a dispute that's associated with the administration of the contract. The language of the contract is being interpreted by them, and it's also being interpreted by both your superintendent and when I say them, being interpreted by the union and the administration, including the superintendent. And then you're advised on the nature of the grievance and on the language by the attorney, and you're also being advised by the attorney on the process itself in terms of how the settlement of the disagreement will play itself out. And then ultimately you're making a decision on is it worth the cost to carry out whatever the settlement will be. Is it worth the cost in terms of carrying this to higher and higher levels in order to get the decision that you want? And that's where your role comes in. But I think this is one of those things that you'll be called on to make some judgments along the way, but ultimately it's about the administration of the contract. And so you have to have a lot of respect for what it is that the superintendent and principals see are the impacts associated with the administration of the contract, and what the attorney is telling you about the process of managing the outcome and the carrying out of the grievance process itself. So that's what I think is important for you to know as a school board member.